Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thanks to those of you who are here for the second day, who were here also yesterday, Sunday, for the first day of this conference on racism, anti-Semitism, and the radical right. I'm Steve Pitti. I'm professor of history and American studies and ethnicity, race, and migration, and I'm the director of the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. I'm co-organizer of the conference along with my friend and colleague Maurice Daniels. We had a wonderful day yesterday, so I want to thank everybody for coming out, for the great crowd. We had terrific presentations, wonderful questions from the audience, and great engagement during the break. So it was, I think, a remarkable day in many respects. For those interested, there's also an article in the Yale Daily News today about yesterday's events, especially if you missed yesterday and want to know what happened. I'd refer you to the YDN article if you're interested. Today is going to be a little bit different. One of the differences today is that it is, of course, a school day on the Yale campus. So we will have some students coming in and out of the building, staff and faculty coming in and out of the building, so there'll be a bit more traffic in the foyer area than we had yesterday. So I just want to alert folks about that and just ask for your mindfulness, knowing that there are staff members with offices here in close proximity to where we are. So if you could keep that in mind, that would be helpful. We had some wonderful engagement between audience members and panelists yesterday, which we're eager to see happen again. One request that I would make of all of us is when given the opportunity to ask questions of the panelists, it would be helpful if we all keep our questions short. If we think about trying to limit those questions to a sentence or two and not use the opportunity to ask a question to go on at length with one's own perspective. That would allow more questions from the audience, more opportunities for the panelists to share what they know. So if we could keep that in mind, that would be very, very helpful. Let's see. I actually left something down here I need to grab. Could you hand me my black folder? It's at the black folder. There's a couple of house rules that I wanted to remind people of today, repeating what we said yesterday. I want to remind people that the Whitney Humanities Center, our wonderful hosts here, don't allow eating or drinking inside of this auditorium, so we don't ask you to keep that in mind. That the emergency exits are located throughout the hall, both here to your left, stage left, and also behind you. So please make sure you know where the emergency exits are. We'd ask you all to please silence your cell phones and to refrain from using any recording devices here in the hall. That means audio recording, video recording, and photography, so please don't do any of that. We ask that any members of the media please check in with a representative of the Yale Office of Public Affairs if you haven't already done that. And you can find somebody to speak with in the lobby if you fall in that category. Restrooms are located, of course, outside of the hall, on the first floor, and also down in the basement. Please contact a staff member out in the foyer area if you have a difficulty locating them. And finally, if you leave the hall and have a small bag, please take it with you and keep in mind that it'll be bag checked on the way back in. The final thing I wanted to remind folks of that we talked about briefly yesterday is the university's policy on free expression. As I think all of you know, Yale strongly believes in the right of individuals to express their opinions, but disruption of a university event isn't consistent with our policies as a university on free expression. So I would just ask that each person here, each person present, respect the right of our speakers to be heard. If a disruption occurs during the conference today, either Maury or I or another university official will ask for an end to the disruptive activity, and if the activity doesn't cease within a reasonable period of time, we'll repeat the request, and we might have to call on police if necessary to remove audience members or help to end the disruption. So we just ask people at the very end of the day to keep that university policy in mind and to, of course, respect the university policy. I'd like now to turn the mic over to our colleague Adam Stern, who will introduce the panelists and get our day going. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are going to start our second day with a panel on anti-Semitism on the right, and we have two speakers with us. Mark Weitzman, who is the Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He is a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, where he spearheaded the adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism by the 31 member countries of the IHRA, and is a participant in the program on religion and foreign policy on the Council of Foreign Relations. Among his books are the Generic Hatred essays in memory of Simon Wiesenthal, which won the 2007 National Jewish Book Award for Best Anthology. Our second speaker, or actually our first speaker, will be David Hirsh, who wrote his PhD at Warwick University on crimes against humanity and international law. His thesis was published as Law Against Genocide, Cosmopolitan Trials, and it won the BSA Philip Abrams Prize for the best book in sociology. His new book, out in August, is Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism. And today he will be speaking about what can a study of the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism on the left teach us about the new right-wing populisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, good morning. I need my glasses because I'm old. This is new for me. I'm newly old. We are seeing a polarization in political discourse on both sides of the Atlantic. The left and the right are coalescing more and more into political communities which tend to define themselves primarily in relation to each other. Anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, racist, and populist discourses have, over the last 2 years, moved with great speed into the mainstream in ways that only a little earlier would have seemed impossible. In Britain, the Brexit movement placed the blame for Britain's key problems on foreigners, Poles and Romanians over here, taking our jobs, and foreign bureaucrats over there, telling us what to do and denying us our sovereignty. In Britain, also, we now have a Labour leadership who famously articulated, Jeremy Corbyn famously articulated his political support for the anti-Semitic movements Hamas and Hezbollah, saying that they were dedicated to peace and justice and to the good of the Palestinian people. He has jumped to the defence of Stephen Sizer, a man who later asked in public whether Israel was responsible for 9/11, saying that Sizer was being unfairly smeared by Zionists. Corbyn had invited Raed Salah, a man who had engaged in medieval-style blood libels against Jews, to have tea with him in the House of Commons, saying that Salah was far from a dangerous man. Corbyn had worked for Press TV, the Iranian state propaganda channel, and he had endorsed Russia Today as being more reliable than the mainstream media. Yesterday we heard how Vladimir Putin's propaganda outfit employs neo-Nazis to delegitimize democratic discourse. And in the United States, as we also heard yesterday, President Trump came to power on a wave of xenophobic and racist rhetoric, smearing Mexicans as rapists and Muslims as terrorists. His final day campaign video was identical to classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Although it didn't mention Jews, it relied on that discourse and it functioned as a dog whistle to those who could understand it. President Trump brought Steve Bannon into the White House, and his anti-Semitism too is not explicit. It is contested and it requires judgment to identify it. Bannon is a man with a long history of involvement and alliances with racist and anti-Semitic politics and movements, as we also heard yesterday. One of the interesting phenomena we are seeing at the moment is that people on the populist right are showing themselves able to identify with some sophistication anti-Semitism on the left, while people on the populist left are showing themselves similarly able to interpret and decode signs of the mainstreaming of right-wing anti-Semitism. There develops a kind of competitiveness. The real anti-Semitism is over there. The right says it's on the left and is discernible via left-wing support for Islamist politics and left-wing tolerance for anti-Semitism within its own ranks. The left says that the real threat comes from right-wing anti-Semitism. It says that while the Nazis themselves at Charlottesville were bad enough, the political support, tolerance and normalisation with which they were greeted by the White House itself is much more symbolic of the magnitude of the anti-Semitic and racist threat. So long as each is sensitive only to the anti-Semitism of the other, but greets talk of anti-Semitism within their own political family with angry denial and counter-accusation, then neither are really opposing anti-Semitism. I have a new book out, Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism. It addresses anti-Semitism within my own political family. Too often, anti-Semitism over here is treated as an aberration amongst friends, while anti-Semitism over there is treated as an essential manifestation of the rottenness of the whole discourse and the whole movement. My book is the story of the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism from the Stalinist periphery of labour and progressive movements into the mainstream. I survey a few of the key defining characteristics of this left anti-Semitism, and then I will go on to show tentatively how some of these same characteristics and structures are also appearing on the populist right, both with respect to anti-Semitism and also with respect to racism, xenophobia and Islamophobia. My book is about anti-Semitism in social spaces which think of themselves as anti-racist and democratic. It is about anti-Semitism amongst people who believe that they strongly oppose anti-Semitism. This kind of anti-Semitism is usually related to hostility to Israel, but it diverges radically from rational or legitimate criticism of Israeli policy. While Israelis and Palestinians are real, localized, and specific, their narratives are often appropriated, blandly simplified, and woven into worldviews which serve people and purposes far away. The book is interested in the growing ossification of a tradition of left-wing thought since the Second World War into key binary oppositions. Interestingly, we heard this yesterday too with respect to the popular right. The key binary oppositions in this form of left-wing thought are black and white, north and south, oppressed and oppressor, imperialist, anti-imperialist, 1%, 99%. The book shows how the socialist tradition of supporting self-liberation of the oppressed in each country is in danger of being surpassed by a new nationalist tradition of supporting whole nations which are designated as oppressed against whole other nations which are designated as oppressor. It is a framework which downplays the importance of democratic values and practices. It is within this framework that Jews, who could not have been more oppressed in 1944, can be thought of 4 short years later as the bearers of white European colonialism. If Jews are defined as oppressors and as white, then the assumption that anti-Semitism will be taken seriously in progressive movements is open to question. The book argues that a politics of position is emerging on the left in preference to a politics of reason or persuasion. This tends to solidify an essentialist notion of who belongs within the community of the oppressed and the community of the progressive. The boundaries of these communities are coming more and more to be policed by coercive discursive practices and less by democratic debate and persuasion. Hostility to Israel can sometimes become a key marker of identity in this process. If Jews are reluctant to embrace this hostile to Israel identity, then they risk exile from what I am calling the community of the good. Jews who are unable or unwilling publicly to disavow their relationship to Israel are being made politically homeless. This phenomenon is being mirrored to some extent on the populist right, whereby support for Israel, which often in fact means support for Likud and for the settler project, tends to be mobilised also as a marker of membership of that political community. Of course, there is a long and menacing history of Christians defining their identity in relation to Jews and later to the Jewish question. As Robert Fine and Philip Spencer make clear in their fantastic new book, the Jewish question is always actually an anti-Semitic question, but it is making an unwelcome return to mainstream discourse. People attempted to ask the David Irving question, what is it that Jews are doing which is leading to the rise of anti-Semitism, rather than the anti-racist question, why are Jews again finding themselves put into the centre of political discourse? My book is anchored in empirical case studies of how anti-Semitism emerges out of the ostensibly democratic discourses of criticism of Israel. There are lots of stories in the book, stories about things that have happened, things that people have said and done, cultures that have arisen, ways in which people have made sense of what was going on. Anti-Semitism is emotional, but it often dresses in the clothes of reason. Anti-Semitism is something we feel we should be able to sniff out and to know in an unmediated way. Yet this is largely a book about people who are unable to do so. So as well as the book of stories and emotions, it is also a book of theory and politics. It is an attempt to understand a complex and contradictory reality, a world in which people's self-consciousness comes into conflict with the ways in which other people interpret them and their actions. Methodologically, it treats discourse as being related to the social movements and cultural spaces within which it develops. This work develops a sociological understanding of anti-Semitism as an external and objective social phenomenon, rather than simply as subjective feelings of hatred or fear within individuals. We often see a slippage in this regard. If somebody says or does something anti-Semitic, if somebody embraces or normalises anti-Semitic or racist politics, if somebody has a record of alliances with anti-Semitic or racist movements, their supporters will often shift the focus from the action or the politics onto the essence of the person. In the 1980s, a certain kind of anti-racism consciousness raising was fashionable. People would sit in a circle and the group would begin like a session of Alcoholics Anonymous, with each person admitting publicly that they were racist. There was a logic to proceeding in this way. We are human beings. We live and are formed within the existing social world. It is complex and contradictory, and so are we. It is impossible simply by an act of the will to cleanse oneself completely of all the unwanted assumptions, feelings, unconscious motivations, and linguistic vocabularies within which we exist. If we begin by admitting that we are not necessarily immune from racism simply because we decide to be anti-racist, then it enables us to examine ourselves honestly without being afraid of denunciation. It is the ones who claim to be pure who we need to worry about. Subjective self-consciousness of being an opponent of anti-Semitism, it turns out, is no guarantee against stumbling into anti-Semitic ways of thinking. Anti-Semitism is an objective social phenomenon because it does not only reside inside our heads, but also in the cultural spaces in between our heads and in the relationships between consciousness, culture, and material reality. Sometimes it is said that hostility to Israel is a cloak which hides anti-Semitism, but this seems to suggest that people who are self-consciously anti-Semitic are adopting hostility to Israel as a way of camouflaging their real underlying Jew-hating motivations. Well, this may be true of David Irving, for example, whose anti-Semitism precedes his criticism of Israel, so-called. But it is more of a puzzle when people who are aware of no anti-Semitic motivations, who think of themselves as implacable opponents of anti-Semitism, act in anti-Semitic ways. Whether the hostility to Israel comes first and the anti-Semitism follows or whether the anti-Semitism comes first, even if it is unconscious, and is a cause of the disproportionate or irrational or unique hostility to Israel, it is difficult to know. Perhaps it makes sense to understand it as a cycle in which both anti-Semitism and hostility to Israel feed on each other. But in any case, the key issue here is that the anti-Semitism remains steadfastly unrecognised and unacknowledged by the person who has stumbled into it. This is important if we are to understand the self-righteous anger and certainty with which such people reject any suggestion that what they have said or done is anti-Semitic. The indignation is genuine. People look within themselves and find an absence of Jew hatred. They find it difficult to understand anti-Semitism as an objective social fact, preferring to see it as an individual, mental, internal sentiment. Having found themselves not guilty of anti-Semitism, they are then tempted to move quickly onto angrily counter-attacking the motives of the people who have brought up the issue. The idea that raising the issue of anti-Semitism is a dirtier trick than anti-Semitism itself is occurring to more and more people independently. The insight is that the debate about contemporary anti-Semitism itself should really be recognised as a manifestation of Zionist ruthlessness and duplicity. This notion, widely held, does serious damage to the possibility of considering anti-Semitism in a measured and rational way, either politically or academically. And this slippage from anti-Semitism relating to what we do or say to anti-Semitism relating to the essence of the person appears on the right as well as on the left. The charge against President Trump and Steve Bannon is that they engage in conspiracy theory and they make alliances with anti-Semitic movements, they employ anti-Semitic dog whistles, and they legitimise and tolerate anti-Semitism. This is why the response that some of their best friends are Jewish, that President Trump has a Jewish grandchild, that Steve Bannon did or did not want his kids to go to school with Jews is irrelevant. We have long seen on the left anti-Zionist Jews mobilising their Jewish identity in order to reassure non-Jews that the politics of boycott and essentialisation are quite unrelated to anti-Semitism. Now we see the ZOA and Trump-supporting Jews offering similar as-a-Jew reassurances. For some time we have been endeavouring to make the point that just because an idea or an element of rhetoric appears in anti-Zionist discourse, it does not necessarily mean that it isn't anti-Semitic. Some kinds of hostility to Israel are, of course, anti-Semitic, while other kinds of criticism of Israeli policy are, of course, entirely legitimate. To discern the difference requires political judgment. But now we're seeing another reversal. Having said hostility to Israel may be anti-Semitic, now we have to say, so may support for Israel be anti-Semitic. My book looks at radical critiques of Israel and Zionism with a focus on how they tend to free themselves from empirical, rational, or comparative methodological constraints. Anti-Zionism began as a critique of a political movement for national self-determination. After the Holocaust and the War of 1948, which radically transformed the material basis of Jewish life, anti-Zionism became something quite new, a movement to abolish an existing nation-state. It then matured, in some cases, into a worldview which repositioned Jewish wrongdoing at the centre of all that is problematic in the world. The critique of an idea is different from the critique of an existing nation-state. Particular Jewish concern with Israel and with its failures takes on a new significance sometimes when it is exported into the wider institutions of civil society. The book is grounded in a sociological way of thinking. This helps it step back from the Israeli and Palestinian nationalist prisms and representations of them which emerge far from the conflict. Debates concerning anti-Semitism are often distorted by incorporation into these narratives. Sociology is itself one of the anti-hegemonic discourses which is vulnerable to anti-Semitic ways of thinking. Yet I argue also that sociology provides resources, methods, and ways of thinking which can be mobilized for understanding and then for opposing anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a threat to Jews, but it is also an indicator of a more profound and general sickness within democratic movements, institutions, and cultures. The study of anti-Semitism is not a parochial Jewish concern. It is key to understanding what threatens the health of democratic and egalitarian movements. The theorists of a new anti-Semitism have argued that hostility to Israel may be anti-Semitic in its motivation, or in its form, or in its disproportionate quantity, or intensity, or in its effect. Each of these suggestions requires distinct analyses, and they may interrelate back on each other in unexpected ways. This is a study of a phenomenon whose very existence is angrily contested. The book's discussion of the struggles over defining anti-Semitism, for example, is itself also a case study of the material in question. The book is critical of those analyses which begin with conceptual blueprints, attempting to demonstrate from argument alone what is racist and what is anti-Semitic. Rather, it begins with empirical study of social movements, of debate, of discussion, of campaigns, and of discourse. It is concerned with how concepts arise, how they actualize, and how they circulate between anti-Semitic and also anti-racist spaces. Here's a quote from Moishe Postone, I think, which really encapsulates the problem that we might well be worried about. Moishe says, "Anti-Semitism can appear to be anti-hegemonic. This is the reason why a century ago Auguste Bebel characterized it as the socialism of fools. Given its subsequent development, it could also have been called the anti-imperialism of fools. As a fetishized form of oppositional consciousness, it is particularly dangerous because it appears to be anti-hegemonic, the expression of a movement of the little people against an intangible global form of domination. It is as a fetishized, profoundly reactionary form of anti-capitalism that I would like to begin discussing the recent surge of modern anti-Semitism in the Arab world," says Moishe Postone. The measure of the real contemporary threat of anti-Semitism is more than the sum of its various practical and immediate threats. The real threat is the mainstreaming and normalisation of anti-Semitic politics in ways which are as yet difficult precisely to predict. Britain, Europe and America may be approaching periods of significant and dangerous insecurity and turmoil. The key elements of democracy itself are under assault from a number of different directions. The distinct and opposing critiques of democracy have more in common with each other than their apparently distinct proponents are sometimes aware of. The far left, the radical intellectuals, the anti-Semites, the xenophobic and Islamophobic right, the radical Islamists, the Trumpists, the Brexiters share a number of perspectives. They have a tendency to embrace discourses in which contempt for democratic states, cultures, contempt for liberals or contempt for neoliberals, contempt for the liberty and equality of human beings are key elements. Profound suspicion of international cooperation and institutions is on the rise. Skepticism extends to the rule of law, to science, to knowledge, to international trade, to the very idea of the market. It is now common to encounter those who believe that these elements are mere facades which hide the old power structures in order to subordinate the many to the few. It is not yet clear how anti-Semitism might play out in the coming years, but the emotional appeal of the populist movements requires enemies. Enemies which are to be found at the centre of dangerous, global and powerful conspiracies. Anti-Semitism has never been just an isolated eccentricity. It has always also been an indicator of a profound political sickness. To tolerate this as a symptom and to miss the fatal disease which causes it may prove to be an error. Thank you.
Our second paper will be Beyond Denial, Holocaust Distortion in the Service of a New Nationalism.
Thank you. I want to begin with looking back to November 1st, 2005, when the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution which resolves that the United Nations will designate 27 January as an annual International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. The resolution formalized the process that had begun to crystallize in 2000, the year that Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson had convened the Stockholm Forum on the Holocaust. The forum, which was attended by high-ranking and senior officials and invited experts from 46 countries, adopted a statement known as the Stockholm Declaration, which included, quote, a commitment to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust and to honor those who stood against it. The forum led to the creation of the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Research, and Remembrance, which in 2013 was renamed the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and now consists of 31 member nations. Full disclosure, I was one of the experts who participated in the Stockholm Forum, and I have been involved as a member of the official U.S. delegation ever since, and I'm also heavily involved at the OSCE level, where I was formerly a member of the panel of experts on freedom of religion and belief. So my presentation here today will also be informed through my direct observation and participation in some of those activities. The Stockholm Forum and Declaration were part of a movement that has led to what one scholar has called the rapid growth in ritualized days of remembrance, or more precisely, an increase in Holocaust commemoration days after 2000, many of which are held on 27 January. These commemorations become a focal point of the public calendar, particularly in Europe, with observances usually centered around high-level political participation, the presence of survivors and official Jewish community representatives, senior religious figures, prominent representatives of civil society, pilgrimages to memorial sites, and major media coverage. The January 27th commemorations have become an extremely important moment of civic performance in Europe, creating a moment in which combine the European countries together in celebration of shared values that transcend individual national concerns. As one scholar has written, that these fundamental ties are based upon, quote, a general agreement that the murder of 6 million Jews should turn into a common memory in which the values of civil society can be built and minorities can be protected as a fundamental European commitments and orientation. However, we are now seeing a disturbing trend where those values are now under attack by those who want to shift to away from liberal values to what Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has proclaimed to be a new illiberal state, and which has penetrated into government circles and halls of power in countries that we define as Western democracies. And since those liberal values are explicitly identified as stemming from the experience of the Holocaust, and since part of the reinvigorated appeal to traditional nationalism, the narrative of the Holocaust itself has come under attack. I'm referring to recent multiple attempts to distort the history of the Holocaust by whitewashing local collaborators or minimizing or even removing the Jewish identity of the victims. Often this is connected to a political agenda that is concerned with creating a traditionalist national narrative that wants to look back to an idealized past for heroes and models. And since many of these societies that have emerged from both Nazi and communist occupation and oppression, the past that they glorify is frequently the last period of home rule before World War II, and the ideals that they glorify can include versions of the traditional anti-Semitism that was prevalent before the war. This has created the paradoxical situation of increased formal national commemoration of the Holocaust at the same time that the historical narrative of what is being commemorated is increasingly under attack from a discourse of distortion. And these attempts cannot be deemed Holocaust denial. David mentioned David Irving, the notorious British Holocaust denier who lost the famous case against Deborah Lipstadt in 2000 and has been reduced to really, lost all credibility as an historian, has been reduced to peddling guided tours to small groups of sympathizers and speaking at neo-Nazi conventions and city halls. The only place where extreme Holocaust denial is now considered to be formally acceptable is in, for example, the government of Iran and other similar circles. The type of Holocaust distortion that we are talking about has been around ever since the end of World War II. A version of it was official policy in many communist countries, where while the number of victims was sometimes even exaggerated, the specific Jewish component of the identity of the victims and the focus of Nazi policy was erased in a politically motivated rendering of all the victims as generic victims of fascism. Perhaps most famously in the original plaque at Babi Yar in Kiev, they referred only again to the generic victims of fascism, and this situation led to Evgeny Evtushenko's famous poem, which highlighted the issue. The use of historians to buttress nationalist ideology is not new. Richard Evans, already writing in 1997 in his book In Defense of History, pointed out that, quote, nationalist historians have frequently argued that they own the past of their own country and that foreigners have no business in trying to appropriate it. The danger that we face today was summed up by Timothy Snyder in the concise formulation that, quote, post-truth is pre-fascism. Perhaps in no country today is the situation more acute than in Poland. There, the most egregious example is the attempt to criminalize Holocaust research and even the memoirs of Holocaust survivors through a proposed new law that builds on an already existing law. Just to give you an idea, part of the law reads, whoever publicly claims, contrary to the historical facts, the Polish nation or the Polish state's responsibility or partial responsibility for the Nazi crimes committed by the German Third Reich shall be liable to a fine or imprisonment for up to 3 years. And this should apply to Polish citizens and to aliens wherever. Thus, according to the law, since Poland was occupied by Nazi Germany during the time of the Holocaust, any person who makes a statement that refers to Polish collaboration or complicity in the murder of millions of Jews killed on Polish soil is potentially committing a crime. It's not totally a new initiative, as Poland is already trying to move against the eminent Princeton historian Jan Gross. Gross, who previously received the Polish Order of Merit in 1996, is the author of the book Neighbors, which tells of 2001, which tells of the murder of several hundred Jews in the town of Jedwabne by their Polish neighbors on July 10, 1941. The book was a National Book Award finalist that has been highly acclaimed, caused a major controversy in Poland where its findings were hotly debated, but did lead at least 2 presidents of Poland to apologize for what happened at Jedwabne. In an interview with a German paper in 2015, Gross stated that in his opinion, Poles murdered more Jews than they had killed Germans. And a statement that is supported by many leading experts, but is obviously highly controversial in Poland. This led to his being investigated with the charge of libeling the Polish nation. He has since, on a visit to Poland, been hauled in for 5 hours of questioning, and the threat continues to hang over him. Indeed, the first prosecutor assigned to the case recommended dropping it, was overruled by superior in what appears to be a political decision. This was made clear by the statement of the government's newly appointed president of the Institute of National Remembrance, which was in charge of Holocaust memory in Poland, who told the parliamentary committee that it was Nazis, not Poles, who killed roughly 300 Jews in Jedwabne. This directly contradicted a formal 2002 finding by his own initiative. And in this, he was only following the path laid out by an August 16th press conference by Poland's Minister of Justice, who said, quote, "It is not our mothers nor our fathers who are responsible for the crimes of the Holocaust caused by German and Nazi criminals in occupied Poland. Our duty is to defend the truth and dignity of the Polish state and the Polish nation, and all our fathers and mothers and our grandfathers." Nothing in there about finding out what happened, nor of the victims. Gross is not really the focal point here. As an esteemed scholar in Poland, in Princeton, he will not suffer from the attempted censorship of inconvenient history. Another highly respected scholar, Jan Grabowski at the University of Ottawa, who has also published on Polish involvement in the finding and killing Jews during the Holocaust, has also been under attack, this time from the Polish embassy itself in Ottawa. I'm going to skip over some of the details there. The full impact of the law itself can be found in its chilling effect on the less established and younger scholars who may fear to speak openly on their findings or to be dissuaded from even beginning to research the subject of Poland and the Holocaust. This is clearly an attempt to legislate history in a place where governments really should not venture. Those of us who have worked with Holocaust survivors know at a certain point in any testimony will come the line that worse than the Germans were the blank, which refers to the local collaborators. And this is clearly, it is not a unique sentiment, and it makes sense because these are the groups who felt the sting of personal relationships fatally betrayed, who've recounted their emotions and experiences, and now, under this new proposed law, are potentially facing criminal charges at the late stage of their life. In my capacity with the IHRA, I was asked to participate with 3 others in a high-level mission to Warsaw last December to discuss the IHRA's great concern over the proposed laws, which directly contradict the Stockholm Declaration, which Poland had signed on to. Indeed, I was told directly there that the Poles were very upset to see the usage of the term Polish death camps still appearing in the West, and were determined to try to wipe it out. They had felt that since education had failed, they had to resort to legal recourse on this. This was puzzling because IHRA and most responsible Holocaust-related institutions and scholars shared Poland's feeling about the inaccuracy and inappropriateness of that term. Indeed, I had been instrumental in my own institution removing it from our website a decade ago, and at last spring's IHRA plenary, I introduced a statement that IHRA should go on record opposing, quote, the historically unsupportable use of the term Polish death camps, which was officially adopted by the organization. So while there seems to be consensus in the expert community that Polish have a case on that, they seem to be blind to the success of their campaign and are persisting with the legal efforts. Last spring, the newly appointed director of the Polish State Tourist Organization decided to drop Auschwitz and the Poland Jewish Museum in Warsaw from the agency's promotions, claiming that he wanted to emphasize the promotion of Polish monuments, culture, and music. And clearly, Auschwitz and the Jewish Museum did not qualify under his ideas. He was quoted as saying, "I do not need to expose places and events related to the history of other nations," making it explicit. Even though he was fired for this action, it is important, as I said, to note that he clearly sees Jews as distinct from the Polish nation. The $115 million new Museum of the Second World War in Gdansk has also become mired in controversy. Timothy Snyder, for example, has been heavily involved with that. The museum's original director was not the only person, the museum last spring had their original director fired and replaced with someone more attuned to the government's line that, according to Jaroslaw Kaczynski, the head of the Polish ruling party, PIS, who explicitly condemned the museum as a tool of German propaganda, stating it is a museum which subscribes to the German historic policy. Another historian, one of the people that we met with on my visit to Warsaw, said we should do something like what the Jewish community has done, which managed to arrange around the Holocaust all the other events of World War II. The Jewish community has succeeded in making the Holocaust, according to him, the dominant narrative of World War II to the exclusion of everything else. The museum's original director is not the only person who lost their job in this ideological purge. The director of Poland's Information Center in Berlin was fired last spring because she was giving, quote, too much attention to Jewish subjects. Among them, what the Poland's culture minister had said included the promotion of a culture of shame over the Holocaust. And a few weeks ago, a report from Poland indicated that the Polish Ministry of Education was dropping the study of Auschwitz from the state curriculum. After the story broke, with the face of strong public criticism for the director of the Auschwitz State Museum and others, Auschwitz was restored almost immediately to the curriculum. So Poland is perhaps the most acute case. There are other cases involved as well. When Viktor Orban was reelected to his second term as Prime Minister of Hungary, his platform included steering Hungary into a more conservative nationalist direction. He spoke openly about it, as I said, quoting, tried to develop a new state that we are building on a liberal state, a non-liberal state, and a year later he followed that up with another speech where he talked about regaining the dominance, not only in Hungary, but throughout Europe, of the national Christian ideology. As the former Yale historian and invaluable blogger Eva Bala has pointed out in her blog Hungarian Spectrum, the Christian national idea was the dominant ideology of the Horthy Nazi era and reflected the anti-Semitism of the Horthy regime. The actual process of restoring the luster to this ideology began to take shape in the form of a preamble to the new constitution of Hungary that was adopted in April 2011, and that basically says that Hungary does not have any responsibility for any action that occurred between the Nazi occupation of Hungary in 1944 and until the end of the communist era in 1990. During this period was exactly late 1944 was the period of the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews when over 400,000 Jews were deported and murdered in Auschwitz. This effort was described by Randolph Brand, the preeminent scholar of the Holocaust in Hungary, that the Orban government is trying to pursue two major objectives: to establish an historical continuity between the Hungarian state of the Horthy era and the Hungarian state of the post-communist period is the first, and to convince the world that Hungary had lost its sovereignty in the wake of the beginning of the German occupation and was the victim itself, not responsible for the subsequent destruction of the Jews. The reality, as I mentioned, is quite different. Brown points out there are approximately 200,000 Hungarian collaborators whose enthusiasm and efficiency were so recognized that the SS, that Adolf Eichmann could write The Hungarians must surely be descended from the Huns, since nowhere else has he seen so much brutality. In 2014, Orbán proceeded to make this revisionist approach highly visible. He ordered a new memorial to be built to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the 1944 German occupation of Hungary. The memorial showed the predatory eagle, symbol of Imperial Germany, swooping down upon the Archangel Gabriel representing Hungary, thus portraying Hungary as a helpless and innocent victim of Nazi aggression. In 2012, the Hungarian government proposed the insertion into the national curriculum of 4 anti-Semitic writers, leading the Jewish community to publicly say they were shocked by the fact that in the school curriculum they were being put forth such authors who were being bonded by their obvious anti-Semitic views. In 2012, the Hungarians attempted to rebury one of these writers' remains in a Romanian town in a ceremony that included the Speaker of the Hungarian Parliament and the Hungarian State Secretary for Culture. The Romanians protested, which led to a diplomatic issue. One of the writers involved, Albert Voss, has become extremely popular in Hungary. According to Eva Ballo, by 2012, Voss was his books were in Transylvania more popular than the Bible. He had written one of his most famous works, and controversial, was called Rat's Conquest, a fable for young Hungarians, which was published in the deportation of 18,000 Jews from Cluj. And it's since been posted on Stormfront, which is the most popular neo-Nazi website, and taken down in the wake of Charlottesville, and on other neo-Nazi websites in the US and in Hungary. The inclusion of Voss prompted the survivor and Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel to write a letter in which he returned his granddaughter the Hungarian Cross of Merit in 2004 to the Hungarian government, complaining of attempts to rehabilitate Voss and other figures that collaborate heavily with the Hungarian fascist regime. A couple of years ago, a series of readings and commemorations were held in quasi-official Hungarian houses in New York and Los Angeles to commemorate Voss, his life, and his works. When I protested the Hungarian consulate in New York, I was told that there was no connection between the consul and the Hungarian houses. So I asked them to publicly condemn the event and distance themselves from it. We had exchange of communications, but the consul general refused to move from his position. I'm quoting, "At the same time, we must observe the sensitivity of those who respect the literature and patriotism of Albert Voss." Other examples abound. They include the statement by the director of the government-sponsored Veritas Historical Institute that the expulsion of Jews in the summer of 1941 to Kamenets-Podolsky, where over 20,000 were murdered, was just a, quote, immigration action. Widespread criticism ensued, but the politically connected director apologized and is still in his position. It is interesting, in light of Hungary's vehement anti-immigration policy and vilification of refugees, to point out that his comment could be read as legitimizing deportation of refugees that leads directly to their murder. Perhaps the most problematic was the proposal to build a new Holocaust museum in Budapest to replace one which already exists in a former synagogue. The plan was conceived as a centerpiece of a large-scale government propaganda project that was focused on the 2014 commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the deportation, and in 2015 to continue on the activities and arrest of Raoul Wallenberg. The strong government backing translated to government control, and the historian Maria Schmidt was named as the project director. On the surface, she had strong credentials, including being known as Orbán's chief ideologue. She's a director of the House of Terror, a museum that deals with the history of the communist secret police, and is perhaps the best supported and most popular museum in Budapest. Her academic training features a specialty in Jewish studies. It includes stints as a researcher or visiting professor at Berlin Technical University's Center for Anti-Semitism Studies, Tel Aviv University, Oxford, Indiana University's Jewish Studies programs, and Yad Vashem. However, from the beginning, the plan was highly controversial. Her writings left her vulnerable to charges of anti-Semitism and Holocaust revisionism, for example, including writing that the Nuremberg trials and similar war crime trials were political trials that served political purposes and therefore brought alien elements to the jurisdictional system. She also had no plans. When I met with her and asked to see the plans of the proposed museum, she showed a few architectural drawings, and that was it. All sorts of issues arose with it. Which finally, these three things, the museum itself, the statue, and the Veritas Institute, led the Jewish community to officially boycott all the Hungarian government commemorations, which was highly embarrassing to the Hungarians because, among other things, they were planning on taking the chair of the IHRA during this period in 2015 to commemorate the events. Without the Jewish community, it was an international black eye. which included the involvement of the United States State Department getting involved and international organizations such as IHRA, and finally led, for example, to a statement by President Obama in January 27th in a commemoration at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, where he said that, I'm just going to go straight to his statement. Last year, a group in Hungary received government funds, and he's referring to another proposal, which is to build a statue to not only Horthy, there's such a Horthy cult of statues that it actually has an entry in his Wikipedia page on this Horthy cult, but also statues to other World War II era collaborators, including one named Balint Homan, who was an historian who basically introduced the Hungarian version of the Nuremberg laws to Hungary, which stripped Jews of their rights and citizenship, ultimately leading to their deportation. The attempt to rehabilitate Homan led to a proposal to build a statue in his honor, to place in his honor, and together with the Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism, I was deeply involved in those efforts to protest it. We had a conference that we organized with an Hungarian NGO in December, right before the statue was supposed to be built. The afternoon after the conference, Orban went into Parliament and made a statement that he would not support any more financially, give government funding or backing to build any more statues of anyone who collaborated with the Nazis in any way, including Horthy and Homan. However, President Obama had made the statement saying, last year a group in Hungary received government funds to build a statue in honor of Balint Homan, a Nazi supporter and proponent of anti-Jewish laws who called for deportation of Jews in 1944. The United States worked with many Hungarians and other interested international groups very hard to prevent the erection of the statue. So we see, in a sense, two contrasting models. In Poland, where the government intransigence has continued, and in Hungary, where on the effect of both local pressure from the Jewish community, international support, and high-level diplomatic intervention, particularly from the United States, there have been some successes in rolling back some of the initiatives. To give an example of how these two models fall out, there are two other countries I'll just briefly refer to. One, Croatia, which is more in the Hungarian model, in which there were Ustashi slogans in front of the, Ustashi were the local collaborators, and there were slogans in front of Jasenovac, the concentration camp, death camp in Croatia, which were just removed under protest after international protest and local Jewish protest. The Jewish community has boycotted the official government commemoration events there the last 2 years, similar to the Hungarian boycott. A minister of Interior who was overseeing Jasenovac, who had Ustashi sympathies, was sacked after 6 months and was replaced. And so there have been some progress, and part of it was based, again, on a recent visit by the current U.S. Special Envoy on Holocaust issues to Croatia just a couple of months ago, where he brought up these issues. Contrast that with Ukraine, which has, similar to Poland, has a law on the books that basically forbids the shaming of the Ukrainian national movement of the OUN, particularly the OUNB, which was the Bandera-led native insurgents and partisans who are also responsible for the killing and ethnic cleansing of tens of thousands of Jews, of hundreds of thousands of Poles. And at this point now, the law in Ukraine forbids any critical comment or research about their activities. It is interesting to note that there are certain commonalities about these countries and the way they fall out. They share, in many cases, a relatively friendly stance toward Israel, motivated in part at least by their anti-Muslim and anti-terrorism policies. They share official support for Holocaust commemoration. 3 of the countries are members of the IHRA. Ukraine is not a member but has been moving tentatively toward membership. They share an extreme nationalist historical discourse that is used to try and undermine the historical narrative of the Holocaust for political purposes. This is crystallized through a synergy of historians and politicians who feed off each other. They frequently resort to stereotypes, particularly of Jews, exemplified most prominently in the campaign against George Soros, for example. And they have a somewhat elastic approach to freedom of speech issues, which is significantly different from the way we would conceive of it. There are, of course, differences as well. As I mentioned, in Hungary and Croatia, the local Jewish communities feel reasonably secure and safe and were able to protest more than in Ukraine and Poland, which now feel more threatened. And finally, as I mentioned, the importance of foreign opinion, and in this case, and here I'm going to head in my concluding remarks, are the role of the United States. The role of the U.S. has been pivotal in forcing change and engagement upon these issues. However, that is now all in question with the rollback from foreign aid and participation that has been imposed by the Trump administration. And the administration itself has had difficulties on these issues. Witness Trump's original January 27th statement about the Holocaust, which omitted any mention of the word Jews. Not to mention his inadvertent, perhaps, remarks of his press secretary, who doubted that Hitler used any sort of chemical means to kill Jews, and as well as Trump's visit to Warsaw, where he did not, breaking tradition, did not visit any of the Holocaust-related sites, spoke in a square that was associated with nationalist ideas, and parroted some of the ideas and themes of the nationalist government, which was noted by commentators, both Jewish and non-Jewish, in Warsaw and out. There are some reports in Polish press, for example, that parts of his speech were written by Sebastian Gorka. Other reports have it that they were written by, or contributed by a colleague of Gorka in the US. Regard to Gorka, I'm just going to say very briefly, the issue to me was not Gorka's membership in this obscure group. The issue was Gorka's participation, or people that he, magazines that he contributed to that were edited by Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites, the circles that he traveled in that he has never disavowed. Gorka's defense comes back to, as we've heard earlier, that he is so pro-Israel, he must be attacked. Whether, and there's a quote, whether it's the president or Steve Bannon or Steve Miller or myself. However, Gorka was also the major defender of the January 27th remarks, calling any criticism of them asinine. This is reflective in the approach that has been popularized by Bannon, which was a return to nationalism. Bannon took the America First isolationist idea that was used as a slogan by Trump and basically put it in the context of an ideological platform related to some of the people that we heard earlier, spoken about earlier, Julie Savola, Rene Gagnon, and so on. The question now, with Bannon and Gorka's firing, is where exactly is the administration going to be going in the future? And we had talked about, many of us had this sort of monochromatic vision that the problem was only in the White House. The reality is, for example, that the White House is more interested in appointing an advisor the special advisor on envoy on anti-Semitism, and the blockage was at the State Department in Secretary of State Tillerson's views, who initially wanted to get rid of that office. So we're left in a situation where we have an extremely chaotic administration that's unclear on what their future is going to be, in the direction that it's going to go with the removal of Bannon and Gorka. And we are left with what, as Timothy Snyder's pointed out, the use of Holocaust for political propaganda leads to the question of, without history, numbers become public, which is to say an instrument in the international competition for martyrdom. Such reasoning allows the nationalist to hug himself with one arm and strike his neighbor with the other. He adds, unfortunately, claiming victim status does not itself bring sound ethical choices. In an era after Charlottesville, where things seem to have changed dramatically, perhaps the best thing that we could say is going back to a previous inhabitant of the Oval Office and to remember the sign that used to hang over the desk of Harry Truman, which was, "The buck stops here." Thank you.